Hello and welcome to Reportage. This is Danish bin Nabi. In today's segment of Reportage, I have with me Mr. Kallol Bhattacherjee to talk about his recently released book, Nehru's First Recruits, published by HarperCollins. The book talks about India's initial diplomats who were recruited, or I can say handpicked by Mr. Nehru. Sir, in the book, in the early parts of the book, you mention about
Yeah.
differences between Mr. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Shankar Bajpai. Despite of the differences, Nehru still inducts him in the foreign ministry and gives him the if I remember it correctly, first Secretary General of MEA. So why did Nehru feel it important to give this important position to one of his, I can say, enemies?
With independence came the realization that a new state had to be created. And along with that state, obviously, there was the requirement of a manpower, that is the human resource. And there was this evolution that also happened at that time within the ranks of the nationalist leaders, because many of them had, for the last decades, uh, prepared themselves and actually had participated in many radical movements, anti imperial struggles, and some of them had even carried out insurgent attacks against the colonial administration. And when Nehru himself came out of prison in 1945 summer, he was in perhaps what one can say safely in the quote unquote revolutionary mode. And so his speeches in 1945 summer till the winter were essentially quite angry. But then, as time passed and as the interim government came in 1946, there was this pragmatic dimension of Nehru that we got to see. And along with that pragmatism, perhaps there was this realization that a new state, when it is born, will have to be led by very effective administrators. And some of the most effective administrators were actually from the ranks of the Indian civil service, which had previously worked within the colonial administration. So therefore, this decision to bring in people like Shankar Bajpai and others was driven by a very pragmatic realization within the national leadership of that time to start a service which would be efficient and which would know what its targets were going to be. So therefore, I think that decision to bring in people like Shankar Bajpai, Subimal Dutt, R.K. Nehru, and many others who were from the ICS was driven by this pragmatic realization and calculation.
In the early parts of the book, you have mentioned and you write that the first diplomatic relations which Nehru administration established rather, were with Indonesia. And then there is this rice diplomacy. For the readers, enlighten us. What was this rice diplomacy and how did India and Indonesia came so close and the relationship flourished between the two?
Well, at the time of independence, the biggest physical reality that faced India was the issue of food insecurity. It was not so much the security, issues like the conventional security issues that we understand today that was haunting India in 1946 and 47. The biggest issue was of food security because the country had gone through the Bengal famine during the Second World War. That's in 1943. And subsequent to that, there were many mini famines that had taken place across the country. And there was this fear that across the country, a mega famine could actually break out. And there was this fear with the ranks of the Indian state at that time that if a new government, that is a post-colonial government, took charge after the departure of the colonial administration, and if it failed to provide food to the free people of India, then that would have been a very big global embarrassment for the newly independent country of India. So Nehru's first goal was to avoid such an embarrassment where he would actually be seen as the prime minister of a country or the prime minister of a government that was failing to provide food to its people. So even before the creation of the interim government from September, October 1946 onwards, there was this attempt within the ranks of the civil society, within the national leaders, and as I have written about Punamale Ramakrishna S. Mani, the journalists and academicians and others, there was this all-round concern about how to ensure food security for poor people of India. And the issue of food security was so widespread that it actually stretched all the way from the middle classes to the lower classes of the population. So it was something that was of very immediate nature, and it was a challenge that had to be dealt with immediately, because the crops had failed in India for subsequent years. On top of it, the entire food cycle that existed in India was disrupted during the Second World War. And food cycle is such that, once it's disrupted because of such international mobilization like the one that we saw during the Second World War, usually takes a long time to recover. So it was.
Talk about a bit. How did this Indonesia came into scheme of things, and how did rice came to India from Indonesia?
Well, this is actually a matter of chance. I mean, this is basically the initiative of one person, that is Punamale Ramakrishna S. Mani, who was responsible for initiating this rice diplomacy between Indonesia and India. Now, Mr. Ramakrishna S. Mani was at that point, that is in 1945, a soldier with the British Indian Army. And he was, in fact, what was then known as a kind of an observer that the military used to chronicle and record and sometimes report the ground warfare as it was unfolding for the headquarters. And Mani was actually walking from Manipur front, and then he went on to serve in Burma front, and then Malaya and in Indonesia. And when he went to Indonesia, he witnessed how the British forces, that is the Indian and Nepali forces, were being used to crush the Indonesian freedom struggle. And after seeing all that, he came back and joined the Free Press Journal in 1946. And after joining the Free Press Journal, he went back to Indonesia as a correspondent to work on the Indonesian situation, because Indonesia was fighting the Dutch imperial imperial system at that time, and was trying to regain independence. And the situation was such that there was an interaction between Ramakrishna S. Mani and one of the Indonesian leaders, that is Sultan Sahrir. And during that conversation with that leader, it was Mani who had suggested that, since he had just come back from India and he had seen the very bad food situation in India, it was he who suggested to Sahrir that if Indonesia, which had actually a bumper crop production in 1945 and 46, whether Indonesia would actually like to provide that food support to India. And it was Sahrir who had then agreed and said that in exchange of some textile items and consumer durable products from India, Indonesia could actually provide the rice that India required back at that time. And that is how the proposal was floated, and there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of misgiving about whether the rice would actually arrive from Indonesia, because the Dutch government was very much against it, and they wanted to be on board of this particular give and take that was happening between the nationalist governments of both sides. And finally, it was during the winter of 1946 that the rice from Indonesia arrived. And India responded by sending lots of textile items from Bombay, and also consumer durable products from southern part of the country.
This happened when Mr. Nehru was the Prime Minister.
He was at that time the leader of the interim government, as we know.
Okay, leader of the interim government, not the Prime Minister.
He was essentially the Prime Minister of the interim government, but we don't call him the Prime Minister yet, because we called him at that time as the Vice President of the Council.
And this is end of 1946. We are still under British rule.
Yeah, we were under British rule, but then we were being prepared for the transfer of power, because we had the interim government, which was kind of a cross-party national government, which had lots of contradictions among all the participants, but nevertheless affect very serious matters like food security and other issues were being dealt with even that time.
Explain it for the viewers. why did Nehru almost handpick these initial recruits? He handpicked them from media background people, stenographers, from radio people. What was this with Nehru to handpick people from varied different sections of the society?
Well, there was no grand strategy or any grand plan. What was on the table was that there had to be a big service that was dedicated to the diplomatic activities of the new state. And
And
India did not have.
before you answer this question, please explain it for the viewers that first it was ICS under British rule, and then it became IFS, which was completely different from ICS. So Nehru had to pick all these people. Please correlate all the three dots.
No, the ICS actually essentially it became the Indian Administrative Service. But when the new service, that is the Indian Foreign Service, was being created, a section of the ICS officers were given that opportunity to opt for IFS, that is the Indian Foreign Service, and it was these officials of ICS, some of these officials from ICS who came on board the IFS, but it was only a chunk of the ICS officers who joined the IFS, because the large majority of the IFS came from the military services, they came from the intelligence services, they came from Indian political service, they also came from the ranks of the rebels and fighters and revolutionaries. There were poets and radio and newspaper persons, and there were interpreters, translators, cultural figures, all sorts of characters, who were given that opportunity, because one had to be a kind of a cosmopolitan person to work in the Foreign Affairs Department of the government of India. So I would remind you that, of course, the ICS perhaps were at that point a good chunk of the IFS, but they were not the whole of the IFS. The IFS also included lots of other people. And there was, as I'm saying, there was not really any grand design or an understanding. It was essentially a recruitment process in which there were these veterans like the ICS and the Indian Political Service and Indian Police Service officers who were allowed to come in. At the same time, there were also irregulars, like, for example, Muhammad Yunus, who was a friend of Mr. Nehru and had gone to prison for working against the British government at that time, and others who were the irregulars. And then there were these all those Group B officers who were stenographers and interpreters and others who also came in. And finally, of course, let us not forget that we had the direct recruits who were known as the competition wallas, for which a huge amount of money was dedicated every year, because they were trained for the first 10 years of the Indian Foreign Service in various foreign locations, and they used to get sent over to Oxford, Cambridge, and other big universities of the West during the first decade, which basically was a practice which ended in 1958.
So this important character, his name is mysterious character rather, Nanu Nembiar. So who was this Nanu? What was his role in External Affairs Ministry?
Well, Nanu Nambiar came in the life of Jawaharlal Nehru when Nehru went traveling to Europe during the 1920s and 1930s. Those were some of his those political tours of the West that Nehru had conducted during the 1920s and 1930s. And Nanu Nambiar was by that time established in Central Europe as a correspondent for some of the prominent newspapers of that time. And whenever Nehru went, he addressed public meetings, and he was a popular leader. He was a young leader from India, and also there was, for a very long time, in the sense that for decades by that time, a good number of Indian students, revolutionaries, all sorts of political thinkers of Indian origin who were resident in Germany mainly, and also in Switzerland. So Nanu Nambiar had grown in that community for more than 25 years before independence. And during this time, he had also graduated to provide support to the activities of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose in Germany, which began from 1930s till, and as we all know, when Netaji actually reached Germany during the Second World War, after he very famously left his residence in Kolkata. So essentially, it was at that time that he joined hands with Netaji and helped him with his very extensive network of the immigrant Indian community in Germany. And he was very famously imprisoned multiple times during his stay in Germany, and then subsequently he was also imprisoned after the end of the Nazi rule in Germany, and he was imprisoned at that time by the liberating forces, that is by the Allied powers. And then, of course, he was brought back to India by Nehru, or rather, he was asked to come back to India and join the Indian Foreign Service when he was traveling here. So it's a very fascinating life of a man who had multiple, he wore multiple hats. He was part-time known as an intelligence operator. He provided intelligence for many sides who were the stakeholders in the political system of Europe at that time. He was also a friend of Nehru as well as Subhash Chandra Bose. And at the same time, after independence, of course, he became India's ambassador to multiple countries, including Sweden and West Germany. So he didn't really have a long career in Indian diplomacy, but for 6 to 7 years, he was, in fact, an Indian ambassador, diplomat in some capacity during the first decade. But he had a lifelong relation with Nehru and also with Indira Gandhi subsequently, which lasted till the time for perhaps I think mid 1980s when he passed away.
Very importantly, in all of the chapters, you keep referring to the history of services. There is also one of the photographs you have with Mr. Natwar Singh of that copy. What is this history of services? And you keep referring to it. It was compiled for the first time in 1957, 1958. For the viewers, what is this history of services that you keep referring in your book?
Well, when the service was being thought of, there was, as I said, there was no grand design behind it. There was no grand plans to have it. Have the service in a certain...
This is the foreign services for the foreign ministry of
the Indian Foreign Service. Exactly. There was no grand vision even. But then all that was understood was that there were certain fundamental ideas like the non-alignment and then one world, which these days sometimes we refer to in Sanskrit as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. But the one world was actually Nehru's idea that he propounded in March, April 1947, I think for the first time. That is just as India was to become independent. And then there were these ideas like Panchashila and others that came in. But apart from these 3-4 ideas, there wasn't really a grand vision of any kind about the Indian Foreign Service itself. And yet, at the end of the first decade, when India had done a very creative kind of diplomacy involving, say, reaching out to the Korean War, moving to the Vietnam scene, and then becoming the chair of all the 3 commissions on Vietnam from 1954 onwards, and also participating in some of the peace building activities in the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Hungarian Crisis of 1956, and then India's participation in the Gaza UN emergency force in the mid-50s. All those activities were very new, and also apart from all these, there was also the incoming visits that took place for the first time in Indian history. And we had such powerful figures like Khrushchev of Soviet Union, Eisenhower and others.
You have talked in detail how those preparations were laid out for the Khrushchev.
Right, of course. So, but then I'm talking about the foreign affairs related activities that were taking place in the 1950s in India for the first time in the Indian history, because our country wasn't really visited by foreign dignitaries or the heads of states before that. So at this particular decade, when all these activities were happening, it was perhaps an understanding was reached in 1957 that now perhaps we should look at all the diplomats who have joined the Indian Foreign Service, and there should be an in-house document. And the Indian Foreign Service officials who had joined in that particular decade were chronicled in the first Indian Foreign Service directory. And the history of services was the title of this directory. It was the first official directory, but it was not called, boringly, an official directory. It was called the history of services. of officers of branches A and B of Indian Foreign Service. So it is known as history of services. In fact, there were a few history of services of that time, even during the subsequent years. But then the first history of services is always the most interesting document to read, because it has these fascinating names, some of whom actually subsequently retired pretty early, like Leela Naidu and others. For example, Girja Shankar Bajpayee's name doesn't figure in the first history of services because he had already retired by that time. But Leela Naidu, who was already on an extension, is featured in the first directory because she was still serving, though she was on an extension. So these names are not found in the subsequent history of services, and therefore I think the first history of services was very special and of very great archival value. And I use this particular document as kind of a landmark document around which a narrative could be built. And my book actually is that narrative that presents the life and all the events and other developments that these people had participated in throughout their time.
More importantly, what I would like to learn from you is that in 1947, we were surrounded by these small French and Dutch colonies. Portuguese were there. For example, Puducherry, it was under the French. And in 1947, they had suffered a humiliating defeat from Nazis also. So Americans were trying to rebuild France. We were trying to take Puducherry back from French people. So how did Nehru basically manage this balance? On the one side, he had America. On the other side, he had problem like Kashmir, Hyderabad, and Junagadh. And he had to dive through all these problems and get Puducherry back into the country. How did Nehru manage all this?
Well, I think from the current historical point of view, the issues of Kashmir, Junagadh, and Hyderabad receive the lion's share of our attention. But when we really go back in time and when we look at the challenges that Nehru was facing, I would say the issue of food and the issue of lack of cohesion of Indian territory was really the two of the biggest issues. And when we talk of the lack of cohesion of the Indian sovereign territory, there the issue of the French and the Portuguese territories come up. And it had to be, the diplomacy to free the French possessions in India of French control had to be carried out very carefully, because France was not a weak power. France was one of the classical imperial powers of Europe, and it had to be dealt with very carefully because after the Second World War, it had re-emerged as an important player on the world platform. And the Indian positions of the Indian French positions were not actually just, as at that time were described as colonial pimples. They were not really pimples. They were very important transport and commercial hubs for the French government, because they served the French interest greatly and also connected France to their massive Southeast Asian territorial position. So before they could reach to, say, Indochina, that is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, they would actually stop at these French locations that were based in India. And there were air connectivity with France, and Pondicherry and other locations like Mahe, Yanam, Karaikal, and Chandannagar were very closely connected to the French headquarters in Paris. So it was not, these locations were not some distant French addresses that Paris didn't care about. In fact, France was quite clear that Indian independence was absolutely different and a separate matter from the French territorial control of some of these enclaves that existed in India at that time. So these were, and the Nehru's diplomacy at that time was therefore aimed at putting continuous pressure on France so that the French government could be convinced to leave their positions, and they could leave that position and also maintain friendly relation with India. So India exerted pressure on France, not just through communication, but also by championing some of the causes that were very, very difficult to handle for France, like, for example, the freedom of Tunisia, the freedom of Morocco, the Algerian cause, and other such causes. And Nehru was at the forefront of championing some of these independence movements of Francophone Africa. So, therefore, all these French enclaves in India and the developments that were taking place in India were connected to France's global, problems in other parts of the world. And Nehru was also involved in somehow negotiating with all those other crisis points. So the network, therefore, is very vast, and it's not just limited to what today we don't even remember, how difficult it was to free a place like Pondicherry, or of course, finally Goa was liberated. But then all these required a lot of maneuvering and a lot of give and take and a lot of negotiation with the French and the Portuguese authorities that took place. And those were the diplomatic efforts of the officials who came in the first decade.
So Nehru was not fighting on one front, he was fighting on multiple fronts, which we don't hear or which we don't watch now, which we have of no understanding now because of the media we have.
Well, that is the problem of looking at past from contemporary point of view, because we really have to travel back in time and understand the physical challenges and the biggest issues that confronted Nehru in his own lifetime. And the biggest issues that Nehru faced were really how to preserve India's independence, how to ensure food security for India, and how to ensure territorial the cohesion of the Indian state. Because what we know is that Sardar Patel helped in the unification of the country, but then Sardar Patel unfortunately did not live long after independence, and much of these negotiations with the French and other forces had to be carried out throughout the 1950s, and that is a very long period of negotiation and conversation that went on for years and years. And remember, while you were negotiating with France, say, for example, on the French territorial control, and also you had the Portuguese, on the other hand, in Goa. You also had a crisis, for example, in Suez that erupted, where France was one of the active participants, because when the war broke out in 1956 in Suez, it was a kind of a joint war by the English, the French, and the Israeli forces. And the Nehru government came out very vocally against the attack by all these three forces on
and
his
he
friend,
supported Egypt.
Nasser's government.
And he supported Egypt that time. He supported his friend.
He supported Egypt.
Yeah.
Yes, he supported Egypt, and it was a very carefully thought out position, because supporting Egypt was the right thing to do, because Nasser helped India in multiple fronts, including in dealing with Pakistan in the Arab capitals of that time, where Pakistan was trying to lobby very actively for its causes, like, say, Kashmir as well as East Pakistan and others.
सर, बहुत इम्पोर्टेंटली एक चीज मैं जानना चाहता हूँ, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ एक्सटर्नल अफेयर्स, विदेश मंत्रालय कैसे बना, किसने नाम दिया विदेश मंत्रालय, कौन वो हिंदी का ऑथर भी क्या, कौन वो हिंदी के एक ऐसे पोइट थे जिन्होंने विदेश मंत्रालय एक मीटिंग में आउट ऑफ नोवेयर से विदेश मंत्रालय नाम पड़ा. I would love to hear this anecdote, how Ministry of External Affairs became Videsh Mantralaya.
Well, as I said, the Indian Foreign Service was created by these interesting bunch of men and a few women who were hired at that time. And one of the people who joined the Indian Foreign Service branch B was the father of Bollywood megastar Amitabh Bachchan, who is Harivansh Rai Bachchan, one of the most famous poets of Hindi literary world. And it was Harivansh Rai Bachchan who came into the service in 1955, and he carried out a very passionate drive to popularize Hindi as an official language within the Indian Foreign Service as well as the Ministry of External Affairs. And Mr. Bachchan also trained a lot of young officers to speak and to write in Hindi. And it was Harivansh Rai Bachchan who had given the name Videsh Mantralaya. And I have written about it, but the story goes like this: that Mr. Bachchan had also given the name of Home Ministry as Desh Mantralaya, which obviously was struck down by Nehru because he felt the Desh Mantralaya would cover the entire country and the entire structure of the government, and he didn't want an overarching ministry which would actually represent all parts of the government. So he was essentially responsible for the term called Videsh Mantralaya. It was a kind of a creative interpretation of the term that is External Affairs Ministry. And he, out of these three English words, he created this twin Hindi kind of an approximation in terms of meaning. And the word Videsh, the expression Videsh Mantralaya was created, and that remains in use till now. So we are grateful to Harivansh Rai Bachchan.
And most of the people do not know that Mr. Harshwant Rai Bachchan worked under Nehru for 8 years.
He was there for 8 years, and he served actually for a decade till I think 1966. And he had a very lively relation with Pandit Nehru, and both of them were in continuous exchange over the use of Hindi as well as English, and how this inter-language relation could be within the government structure. So it was a very interesting relation to study.
Sir, I am terribly running out of my time. So putting my last question to you, the character of Mirza Rashid Ali Beg, who also had worked with Mr. Jinnah, who was responsible for 1955 Russian delegation's visit. Who was Mr. Rashid Ali Mirza Beg?
Well, Mirza Rashid Ali Beg came from an aristocratic family of Hyderabad, and his father was in the service of the Nizam, and they had basically worked all across some of these kingdoms and principalities that existed, and also worked very closely with the British government. And M.R.A. Beg was actually a soldier, and rather officer in the British Army at a very young age. And during his early postings in North India, he came in contact with the Nehru family, that is in Allahabad, and he also met Sarojini Naidu and Motilal Nehru, as well as Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And it was the 1920s, and a lot of new things were happening in India. It was basically the period after the non-cooperation movement of 1920, 1919. And this period when a lot of these, exchanges and discussions were happening, basically shaped Mirza Rashid Ali Beg's intellectual perspective. And he therefore came to acquire a very close relation with all these characters, though he was much younger to them, but slowly, gradually, he came close to these historic figures. And when Mr. Jinnah returned from London after his 6-year exile in London, in the mid-30s, he reached out to M.R.A. Beg and asked him to become his secretary. And Beg actually served as his secretary till about the time when Jinnah actually went to Lahore for that famous resolution on Pakistan. And he was completely against that resolution. And at that time, he because of his disagreements with Mr. Jinnah, he resigned. And then, of course, he became the Sheriff of Bombay, and he had a very good relation with some of the Congress politicians of that time, including Kulsum Sayani and some other leaders. And his tenure in Bombay was noted for his active participation in the city's affairs. And when India was becoming independent, he was again approached and was made to represent India in some of these colonial enclaves like in Pondicherry and then Goa. So he served in these French and Portuguese locations, which, as we can understand today, that they had to have Indian envoys because these were, after all, quote-unquote foreign territories. So M.R.A. Beg served in these quote-unquote foreign territories in the late 1940s. And during that time, he became part of the Indian Foreign Service. And then, of course, his most famous stint was for several years during the mid-1950s. He was the chief of protocol of the Ministry of External Affairs, whereby the entire process of welcoming and hosting and entertaining the foreign heads of states and kings and queens was largely his responsibility. So he left an indelible imprint because he was the person who had hosted people like, say, Khrushchev and Eisenhower and others, and also the Queen Elizabeth, and many other kings and queens, including the Nepal king, King Tribhuvan, and others. So he was quite an historic figure and very elegant writer as well, because he wrote a very interesting autobiography many decades ago, and it still reads very elegant when we read it. And I was fortunate enough to get support of his family, especially his son Murad, who of course is known for his writings on automobiles, one of the early writers on automobiles in India. So Murad was quite helpful to me, and he also shared some of the photographs of his father for this book.
Mr. Bhattacherjee, I am afraid I am terribly running out of time. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for talking to me, and let me hold your book once again for the audience, so it reaches maximum people, they buy and read it and understand what
so
Nehru has done for India. Thank you. Thank you very much for talking.
So much.
Please subscribe to our channel Reportage and press the bell icon to remain updated.